Blood on calico, sunlight like a knife, and a crowd that cheered as if cruelty were sport. A girl stood with a rope looped casually around her wrist, not tight enough to bruise, just tight enough to humiliate. A placard fluttered on her chest in the dust-laden wind, a single word scrawled by a bored clerk with poor spelling and worse mercy: useless. A fly crawled along the curve of her throat as if to prove the word true. The hammer on a rusted revolver clicked somewhere behind her. Laughter rolled down the main street, thick as smoke. The auctioneer's hat brim threw a shadow across her face, and in that moving patch of shade she remembered every time she had been told to be quiet, to be small, to be nothing. Before we begin this journey, here's a quick word from me to you beyond the campfire's edge. If stories of grit and grace in the raw bones of the American frontier speak to you, if you like your heart to race and your eyes to sting, subscribe now and tap that little bell so you don't miss the next ride. A single click helps this channel keep saddling up more tales like this one. Now, back to the dust, the rope, and the decision that would change everything. New Mexico Territory, 1879. Prosper Gulch wasn't prosperous and barely a gulch, more a scabbed patch of false fronts nailed to hope. The sun hung like a skillet over roofs that leaned into each other to keep from falling. Mule dropping steamed in the rut-furrowed street. A busted guitar leaned in the saloon doorway, missing 2 strings but bravely singing anyway when the wind pushed through. Somewhere, a blacksmith hammered a rhythm that sounded like a clock that had lost patience. Temperance Hale had been named for a virtue, then instructed to keep it and nothing else. 22, too spared to be a prize, too stubborn to pretend its sweetness, Tempe had hands made for labor and a gaze that didn't break when men tried to bend it. Her father, Cyrus, said she cost more in flour than she'd ever fetch in bride price. Her stepmother nodded as if approving a ledger. They called it a transaction so they wouldn't have to call it what it was. The price was a paltry stack of coins and 2 kegs of tar. The buyer was a foreman from the road crew who needed someone meaner than the river to haul rock and endure jeers. The crowd approved by spitting. Tempe stood straight because that was what dignity looked like when you'd never been taught the word. She did not plead. She did not tremble outwardly, though the inside of her shook as if the world were a wagon crossing a ragged ford. She stared past everyone into the wavering heat and thought, if no one comes, I will live anyway. I will live like a weed in a crack in the rock. Behind the laughed line of onlookers, where the street sagged into scrub and the scrub stretched to hills, a figure became part of the scene so slowly that no one noticed until noticing was too late. He was the color of the country, sun-scarred, pine-stained, wind-burnished. A leather coat older than some of the buildings lay across shoulders that carried their own quiet weather. Boots hung an extra season of travel above the heels. He led a mule that looked half donkey, half wise man. His face was a map of ridges and calm. They called him Rowan Wilder in the places where he traded winter hides for salt and a single glass bottle of molasses each year. Some said he grew out of a tree. Some said he died 5 summers ago and hadn't yet heard it. The hill said nothing about him at all, which felt like truth. What he did next didn't look like rescue and didn't sound like heroism. He simply stepped into the light and set a canvas sack down, the weight of it thunking like the end of a long sentence. He untied its mouth and rolled down the lip for all to see. Coyote pelts, tan and silver. A wolf hide with winter still clinging to it. A stack of iron traps he'd hammered back into shape with his own hands. A coffee tin that wasn't coffee at all, but coin gathered one creek crossing at a time. He looked at Tempe the way a carpenter looks at a plank, seeing grain, not flaw. The auctioneer found his smile crumbling like old plaster. Rowan spoke few words and fewer loudly, but his meaning moved like weather. He set down a squared timber he'd planed himself, laid it beside the sack as if to say, I know what a roof costs. Here is the start. Tempe understood the offer without hearing it spelled. It wasn't the coin that mattered, it was the open door inside it. Come and be no one's property. Come and be tired for something you chose. Come and learn to breathe air that hasn't been spoken for, or if you'd rather, walk away and choose something else entirely. Whatever direction you go, that will be your own. The rope fell from her wrist. She walked toward the mule's patient eye like someone approaching a spring after a drought she had been told was permanent. Her father's surprise arrived late and ineffective. Her stepmother pinched her lips into a seam that would never open again. The foreman cursed into his palm as if he could keep the words escaping his own bad luck. The town muttered about a fool and a mountain ghost and a girl who didn't know the cost of cold. Tempe climbed into a world that smelled of pine and distance, and Prosper Gulch receded behind her like an excuse. The first climb broke the road into stone and the stone into steps. Rowan walked ahead without commentary. He moved like the land had introduced itself to him once, and he paid attention. The mule swung its ears like weather vanes. Tempe's shoes, thin and city-meant, discovered the split language of shale. Heat boiled the scent of creosote and old storms from the dirt. Far off, thunder broke its knuckles on distant mesas, but nothing came of it. At a creek that laughed to itself in the shadow of cottonwoods, Rowan cupped water and drank. He handed Tempe a tin cup, dented like a veteran's memory. She drank until she remembered what clean tasted like. He did not watch her drink as if waiting for something owed. They walked on. He taught her the quiet by living in it until she learned that silence is not the absence of kindness but sometimes its truest expression. By dusk, a flat-shouldered mountain stood before them like a promise in stone. Twilight poured into the hollows, blue as bruise, and beautiful. The place he called home for part of each year wasn't a home yet. It was an idea with corners. A log foundation nested into the slope like a hand settling into a glove. A stack of milled planks winked from under a tarp. There was a chimney that had learned its shape from patience and the way stones want to hold heat. A lean-to dared the weather to do its worst and often lost, but didn't surrender. Rowan set down burdens as if he were returning borrowed things. Tempe felt the ridge lift her lungs. He gave her space like a blanket. He pointed to the lean-to, gave the brief nod of someone offering the better of two beds to a guest. That night, she looked at a ceiling of tarred canvas and thought of roofs she had slept beneath. Thin boards stained by leaked rain. Rooms where men laughed through walls. Silence that rotted into fear. This silence was a different animal. It curled near her like a dog deciding to trust. Morning broke like metal warmed in fire. Dull at first, then bright enough to work by. Work is another word for prayer when no church will have you. Tempe learned what angle a maul wants and how far a shoulder can be asked to go before it calls a truce. She learned to notch without splintering, to carry the wet weight of clay for chinking, to hear the plank's low music under a plane and know by sound when the blade bit true. Her palms blistered, healed, toughened, told a new story. Rowan showed without boasting. He corrected without cutting. He never rushed for hands, only the daylight when clouds threatened to steal it. He let her make mistakes big enough to know and small enough to mend. He trusted her with the axe sooner than she trusted herself. When the handle blistered the heel of her thumb, he wrapped a strip of deer hide around it without ceremony as if the tool had always been meant for her and was embarrassed it had not greeted her right. Days bent towards something like a life. The table saw its first meal, a stew that tasted of rabbit and relief. A shelf met its first purpose, holding a chipped blue bowl that did not break because no one slammed it down. Evenings belonged to the kind of tire that puts its arm around you without taking anything else. Rowan whittled shapes that remembered the animals they came from. Tempe touched the letters stamped into the head of a vintage nail and wondered at the hands that had held it before. In quiet moments, she chased the ghost of a skill she had lost years ago when a stepmother decided letters were dangerous. A scrap of newspaper lining a crate became a riddle she slowly learned to answer. A headline about rail barons sprouted vowels. Rowan, who had once laid track before soldiers' boots changed his map of the world, watched and placed a pencil in reach as if it had simply fallen there. She came to know the mountain by its faces. A cliff that wore winter like a sash. A grove where the aspens kept their gossip in the leaves and told it only when wind bribed them. A meadow that drank snowmelt and offered up flowers that seemed absurdly fragile until you saw their roots. Tempe didn't forgive her past out loud, but her feet began to move through the present as if absolution were a path, not a verdict. Trouble does not care if you are rebuilding. It takes the shortest road. It arrived first as weather that collected on the horizon and decided to become a flash flood. The sky stacked a purple miles high and let go all at once. The creek swelled so quickly the banks forgot their job. Rowan and Tempe hauled the milled planks to higher ground while the mule looked offended that water would dare to be water in such quantities. Tempe slipped to her knees in the clotting mud, grit embedded in skin that had nothing left smooth to give. Rowan offered a hand, then acted as if he hadn't, in case pride was a limb she needed to test. They saved enough to keep building.
They lost enough to learn how to start again. The storm tore the lean-to's edge and scattered the firewood into the scrub. They gathered it like elders after a fall, careful, tender, grateful for what had not broken. Then came men, because men always came to the edges of anything that looked like peace. 2 riders first, faces shaded by brims that had seen no real work. One wore a vest that wanted applause, one wore a grin that wanted witnesses. They rode up with the certainty of people who have never had the land tell them no. They spoke Tempe's family name like a claim check. They asked after a debt as if it were a natural force. They carried papers with seals that looked important in town rooms where dust did not attend. Up here, the paper went limp in the damp air. Tempe listened and felt the old tremor in her bones. Rowan stood near the threshold the way mountains stand, present, not inflamed. He didn't take a rifle down. He didn't need to. He had the kind of reputation that's spread by silence alone. The men left with their dignity dragging behind their horses like a loose strap. Tempe watched them go and realized that courage sometimes looks like not flinching publicly so you can cry privately when no one can weaponize it. Winter announced itself early by dusting the ridge with a promise and a warning. Rowan was prepared the way only a man is who has learned that the body is weak without wood, that hunger is democracy's ender, that wind will choose you if you don't choose walling. They stacked, they salted, they planned. He went out for 2 days to check trap lines along a run of pines that had the slope's humor. Tempe woke to the mule's bray punching the morning. She ran outside and saw him coming in crooked, a strip of red shining beneath his coat like a sash he had not meant to wear. An elk's antler had found him when he found the calf. The wound was a deep story written in rough script along his side. Tempe did not panic outwardly. She dragged him into the cabin because sometimes you choose what your strength is for. She boiled rags and risked the scald. She cleaned the wound with hands that trembled only enough to remind her she was human. She tore up the only good sheet without a ceremony of reluctance. She kept the fire even. She tried her way through spruce pitch and boiled water and the stubbornness of flesh. Rowan's eyes stayed open, less and less. When they were open, they carried the unvarnished trust of someone who has already decided whether he believes in you. Weeks changed shape. Short daytime, long worry. Tempe did the work of 2 bodies while guarding the one that mattered more than her pride would let her confess. She split logs, each strike a hymn, each burst of fibers a yes. She carried water in pails that leaped and splashed because water has its own ideas. She went back and refilled. She baited traps and cried the first time an animal looked at her with what she swore was accusation. Then she remembered Rowan's winter promise. We take and we thank, and we take only what we can keep from wasting. She whispered thank you to rabbit and snow, as if the mountain were a church and the pews were pine. At night, she leaned over Rowan's slow breath and counted not just the seconds between, but the life within. She read to him from that scrap of newspaper until the creases held her fingerprints permanent. She made words where there had been only blurs. In the longer silences, she made her own, telling him the story of a girl who used to think worth was something men measured with their eyes, and was finally learning that worth is the weight of your own choice. His fever broke on a dawn that smelled different, like the flint edge of hope. Spring doesn't knock in the mountains. It breaks in like a friend who owns a key. The creek swelled to laughter instead of threat. The aspen leaves arrived with the sound of applause. Rowan sat up one morning and declared it time to whittle again by picking up the knife and beginning, which is the only way to declare such things. His strength returned as if it had been hiding during a long game and was ready to be found. Tempe slowed down not because she needed to, but because stopping quickly felt like an insult to everything she had carried. Word travels over ridges like gossip carried by hawks. Women from down the valley appeared at the edge of the clearing. They came cautious, heads bent, baskets on arms that knew labor. They had children who watched the world with the hunger that comes before fear is taught. One woman had a boy who wanted numbers. Another had a girl who touched the letters on a flour sack like talismans. Tempe saw herself in their reach and did not look away. A table built for meals became a school, because many good things are just objects used twice. She wrote with charcoal on scraps and said the alphabet as if it were a prayer someone had tried to interrupt and failed. A basket of eggs became payment. A jar of fat became tuition. Pride did not attend. The school grew the way beans climb, steady, given string. Tempe learned to teach by paying attention to what light passed through each child's eyes when a sound matched a symbol and the world clicked open like a box. Rowan watched from a respectful distance and made stools that wobble-tested under his palm until he nodded, satisfied that these small bodies would not hit the floor. He cut a plank and sanded it smooth and laid it before Tempe without proclamation. She carved her name into it letter by letter with the tip of a nail and the patience she had earned. The board did not care that the letters were uneven. Neither did she. She hung it above the door to claim an existence denied by paper elsewhere. Prosper Gulch noticed in the way places notice, first with ridicule, then with curiosity, then with grudging respect. A man who once called Tempe a burden sent a cousin's boy up the slope with an old slate. A woman who had never looked Tempe in the eye brought beans and left quick as if her charity might be seen and punished. The wind carried rumors and tried to drop them on the cabin roof. Most slid off. Some stuck for a night, then blew away because they had no hooks here. It might have been enough, survival made into living if the past were a kind of animal that tires. But it keeps pace like a shadow at noon. It came back wearing its Sunday best. A preacher from town climbed the trail with Tempe's father and two men with a legal look about them, carrying a paper the size of certainty and a stamp that meant empire to people who had never met a river. They came not to request, but to declare. The paper held words that tried to turn Tempe's body into a deed. It said she had been promised in marriage to a man who had paid for a wife, like a brace of nails, and that she had been delivered and then stolen. The lawmen liked the taste of the word stolen under their tongues. The preacher liked the angle of his chin in judgment. Her father liked the arithmetic of power. One signature plus one seal equal obedience. Tempe's hands felt suddenly empty of weight and full of history. She did not pick up a skillet like a weapon. She did not run. She stood with her name on the plank above the door and let that board carry some of the trembling. Rowan came to the threshold and stayed in it, 1 foot on wood, 1 foot on earth. He didn't reach for a gun because he had decided long ago that guns invite a kind of man to the party you never wanted. He didn't invite the preacher in because he had decided long ago that some thresholds are there to be honored most by holding. The preacher recited and the men with hats took turns looking important. The paper claimed to make a wife out of air and a signature out of a person. Tempe listened and recognized a trick she had grown up under, the way words could be bent to decide your fate and call themselves holy while doing it. She said no without raising her voice. It was a no that had crossed a winter to be spoken. Her father turned a color best left unnamed. The preacher tried to swell in size and found the mountain had already filled the space. The men with hats took a step back without meaning to. They left, looking smaller on the trail than men with papers prefer to look. The cabin's shadow lengthened into summer. Joy warms wood. Sorrow seasons it. Both visited and left their marks. One afternoon, a rider came with dust in his teeth and a mouth too dry to pronounce what needed saying. A claim had collapsed near the river cut, and there were bodies under boards that once looked like safety. Tempe went, because everything she did now came from a different ledger. She tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, the same way she did when starting a lesson, and crawled into bracing that moaned as if pain were a timber. She lifted and braced and whispered to boys who would not see another dawn and held hands that had not been held kindly enough. She didn't ask who was worthy. She pulled and dragged and willed. When the last living one was out, she sat on the dirt and tasted iron and wanted to weep and could not, because water is a ration the body keeps track of without permission. That night, she leaned into the crook of her arm while Rowan pretended to be in the other room and failed at pretending. The mountain gave what it could, the world took what it always takes, but quiet returned and with it a deeper thread between two people who had built a place where respect was not a favor. The daylilies beside the stoop opened like little suns. The mule perfected the art of judging. The school grew by 2 more slates. Tempe woke with the sensation that she had stepped into the shape of herself and liked the fit.
Then the twist arrived, not with thunder this time, but with paper and iron badges and a name spoken like a charge. A small troop of men rode in with Navy Colts heavy and a warrant heavier. They didn't come from Prosper Gulch. Their coats were too new for that, their boots too sure, their faces too used to getting exactly what they asked for. The warrant said Rowan Wilder had another name before he took the one this lad gave him. It said he had overseen a blast on a railroad cut 3 years prior that killed 2 men and wounded a third. It said he had run. It said there was money for whoever brought him back. It said words like manslaughter and fleeing and custody and property seizure in case of resistance. It attached numbers to grief and called the sum justice. The paper bore the territorial seal and a judge's looping signature that looked like a snake too lazy to bite. Rowan didn't argue that day in the cut. He didn't tell them how the charge had been wired by someone who wanted the rock to fall early so they could get home for a christening. He didn't say he dragged a man out with a crushed leg and carried him to a doctor who sobbed and cried. He didn't say how the foreman had blamed whoever wasn't there to blame. He didn't say the foreman had been the same man who had once considered buying Tempe as if she were a tool with a handle. He didn't say what Tempe did not yet know, that the foreman had filed the warrant because men like him prefer death that looks lawful to life that denies them power. Tempe heard the name on the paper that was not the name she knew and felt the floor tilt. She didn't stumble. She looked at Rowan and saw not a stranger, but a story with a chapter she hadn't read yet. She looked at the lawmen and saw men whose boots would crush the flowers along the stoop if someone didn't care to say otherwise. She looked at the school table and saw the chalk dust on its surface like snow that might never fall again if she did not fight for it. She looked at the children gathered at the edge of the clearing, eyes wide and breath held. She looked at the plank over the door bearing her name and understood that walls cannot keep fate away, only give you somewhere good to stand when it knocks. The lead man with the cleanest coat announced they would search, they would chain, they would seize. He announced it inside the cadence of verdicts. He looked at Tempe like an obstacle that would become furniture with enough shoving. He reached for the latch as if doorways belonged to writs and not to the people who built them. Rowan put one hand on the frame and did not move. The world held its breath. Tempe stepped forward with a steadiness that came from nights spent not sleeping through fear and days spent choosing anyway. She positioned her body in a space her old life would have called above her station. She met the lawman's eyes with the precise temperature required to turn steel into a mirror. Somewhere behind the line of polished coats, a horse snorted at a fly. A hawk turned on a lazy circle and watched as if the whole valley were a ledger and it had been asked to notarize it. And here, in this breath between the life they had built and the hand closing around it, the wind shifted, the kind of small change that means more later when people retell it. All at once, the clearing filled with an unexpected congregation, not the women with eggs and jars of fat this time, but men whose faces had forgotten how to perform cruelty, and boys who owed their legs to Tempe's arms, and a widow who had found her voice by sounding out letters one winter afternoon. They came with nothing that looked like weapons, unless you counted memory and gratitude. They came with their children who had carried a story long after these trees were cut for someone else's beam. The lead lawman's palm rested on his pistol, not nervous yet, just rehearsing. The deputy to his left shifted weight for a better view of Rowan's stance.
The warrant lay like a threat on the saddle of a horse that did not care. Tempe's heart pounded not like panic now, but like a drum you walk to, not run from. She lifted her chin. She knew that whatever she said next would make a shape out of their days. She knew that shape could be a coffin or a door. You and I right now are standing at the edge of that decision with her. If you're still here, if your pulse is riding with hers, hit that like button so more wanderers can find this campfire. And brace yourself, because what comes next will decide who these people really are. Tempe took one breath, then another, and then she chose. She reached beneath the table where the children had learned the first letter of their names and pulled out a bundled roll of parchment she had not told Rowan about because she had not believed it could be real until this exact moment. Weeks earlier, a boy from the claims had brought her a tattered map he'd found wedged behind a rotting beam in an abandoned survey office. The map marked a spring on the very slope their cabin crowned. The spring fed the valley when other water ran miserly. The map bore a designation inked in a hand from a decade past, a hand that had belonged to Tempe's mother before the woman was driven from the town ledger. The designation read, Hale's Right. The deed, never filed in Prosper Gulch, had been recorded in another county where a clerk did not know whose power to favor. The parchment in Tempe's hands was that record's certified copy, stamped a month ago by a woman with a copper brooch who'd believed Tempe before anyone else did. Ownership, the ugly cousin of freedom, could sometimes be used to protect the thing it tried to name. The spring and the ground around it formed a legal boundary that made strangers' boots trespass the moment they crossed it without invitation. The cabin stood square within that boundary. Tempe held the parchment high enough for the deputy with the better eyes to read the stamp. The lawmen's mouths tightened in the lines that meant recalculation. Rowan's gaze flicked to Tempe with a shock almost equal to admiration. The gathered valley folk leaned as if watching someone tightrope. It might have been enough. It might have been a wedge that pried open a delay or even a dismissal. But the man who'd signed the original warrant had anticipated obstacles. He had friends who wore paper like armor and habit like justification. Attached to Rowan's warrant was a fresh sheet with a different stamp, and the lawman unfolded it with a flourish that felt rehearsed. It authorized seizure of any property aiding and abetting a fugitive in evading arrest. The words aiding and abetting tasted like ash as he said them, even to him. He declared that the cabin could be impounded. He declared that the tables and the stools and the chalk and the plank with Tempe's name all could be hauled down the slope and locked in a shed beside the jail until a judge decided which letters mattered more. The ones children learned at that table, or the ones that danced across a judge's paper like spiders drunk on ink.
Rowan looked old for the first time Tempe had seen it. Not in body, but in the part of a man that counts how many times he has tried to do right and been called wrong for the effort. Tempe's hands tightened on the deed until the parchment crackled. The women at the back murmured low. The boys Tempe had pulled from the collapsed claim glanced at each other, then at the doorframe, then at the lawmen's hands near their guns. A sound rose from the pines. Not the wind, not a hawk, not thunder gathering. It was a single rifle being cocked, then another, then another. The mechanical chorus that puts a notch in a moment and says things are different now. But the barrels did not belong to the men with coats. They belonged to shadows on the ridge above, where trappers knew how to vanish and only appear when the ledger demanded it. These were men who had watched the school grow and found themselves learning too, that you can be taught to read after 40, that you can unlearn a sneer, that a girl you called nothing one winter can become the person who reads a letter aloud in spring that tells you your boy survived a fever and will come home. Their rifles did not tremble. They did not point quite at anyone, just near enough to say, "We will not watch quietly." The lead lawman lifted his palm, the universal gesture for weight. He could feel history sniffing the air. He could feel his own name trying on futures, some of them ugly. He could feel the warrant like a stone in his pocket that would drag him under a river if he stepped wrong. He could also feel pride like a knife in the boot. Pride makes more widows than war sometimes. He signaled with 2 fingers so small the gesture barely counted. The deputy on the left slid his boot an inch because inches become arguments and arguments become men on dirt, and he was already bored of this patience. Rowan whispered Tempe's name without speaking.
Tempe answered without sound. "Not yet. Not ever. Not if there is any other shape we can give this day." The mule hee-hawed as if to punctuate. A scrap of paper the size of a memory tore free from the warrant in the lawman's hand and spiraled on a breeze. A child darted after it by instinct, small legs quick as the thought that preceded them. The deputy moved his heel that inch again, and his holster creaked and his strap caught, and the sound was too close to a draw to be anything but dangerous. Tempe saw all the threads cross at once: paper, pride, gun oil, letters, children, names. She stepped into the space where the child and the deputy were going to collide, not because she had time to think, but because all the thinking she had ever done added up to this: if you stand in a door long enough, you become the door. The deputy's hand jerked toward his pistol in the ancient language of fear. The rifles on the ridge ratcheted half a breath tighter. The lead lawman yelled a word meant to stop all time. The preacher on the trail below muttered an unhelpful prayer that tried to claim ownership of the outcome. Rowan moved as if his body had been waiting its whole life to take a bullet for someone and had simply been looking for the right person. Tempe moved as if she had made a covenant with every woman who had ever been sold and then dared to buy back her life with the only coin that ever truly counts. And the trigger that decided this day belonged to a figure no one had noticed, because the world prefers to be surprised by small people. A girl from Tempe's table, hair braided with the ribbon someone Pulse's mama had pressed into her palm, held a slingshot made from a forked branch Rowan had carved to keep boys from carving trouble. She pulled leather, released, and the stone arced with impossible mercy. It struck the lead lawman's wrist at the precise second he would have waved a command he could not take back. The pistol he had not yet drawn jumped an inch in its holster. The motion startled the deputy enough to make him pause. The pause allowed air to return to lungs that had forgotten how. The rifles on the ridge held steady without erupting. You can feel relief arrive like rain on a very hot day. It slicked the moment and made everything a little more slippery, a little less certain, thereby saving lives. Tempe took one step, then another, toward the lead lawman, parchment in hand like a flag that refused to be battle. She spoke in a voice that had learned its own strength in private and was now willing to be heard. She told him the story the warrant did not contain: the blast, the timing, the man saved, the foreman's signature on both bounty and bribe, the way women pay for men's shortcuts. She told him who in this valley would be orphaned by pride today if he insisted on his inch. She told him that power does not become justice just because you pressed a seal into wax. She told him that if they took the school and the door and the plank with her name, they would have to carry it past the children who had carved their first letters there, and those letters would mark them like burrs on wool for the rest of their days. The lawman's mouth tried to shape a refusal and found itself tired. His eyes wandered to the ridge where the rifles remained opinions waiting to become outcomes. He looked at the girl with the ribbon and the slingshot and thought of a daughter he had left in a town with better sidewalks. He looked at Rowan and saw a man whose guilt, if it existed, had already been paid into the world 100 times over in boards plain straight and boys carried out from under failure. He looked at Tempe and saw a person who had turned desert into shelter with nothing but hands and a refusal to be defined by any man's leisure. He took a breath, as if to say, "Stand down." And then a sound split the clearing that did not belong to this conversation at all. From the trail below, where the preacher had retreated to the safety of distance and righteousness, came the furious rattle of a wagon tearing uphill beyond sense. Its driver was not careful. Its cargo sloshed like fury. Tar spilled from open kegs, a black river following a wheel's groove. The horses came hard, eyes rolling white. The man who had once tried to buy Tempe shouted orders that confused animal and man alike. The foreman's vest gleamed like a boast. He stood up in the wobbling wagon as if to make an altar of himself. Behind him, a second wagon followed with loaded men who wore contempt like a uniform. They had come because someone had sent a wire down valley saying a school had gotten a biddy. The first wagon hit a rut and climbed it wrong. The barrel at the back leaped like a living thing and split open at the seam. Tart geysered hot and thick and cascaded toward the cabin door, the table, the plank, the skirts of women who had come to watch, the boots of lawmen who had expected obedience, the feet of boys who had been taught to count to 10. The black liquid ran to life like a tongue. The foreman raised a showman's flourish meant for a story he thought he would tell later, and the brand flew from his hand not on purpose but because he had never been good with anything that required care. The brand described its bright arc, beautiful if you didn't understand what beauty does to the unprepared. It hung in air, deciding. It dropped. Everything that had been decided so delicately in words and inches now faced fire. The tar kindled with an eager whoosh. Balaman shouted and forgot mission. The ridge rifle swore without speaking. The children's eyes swallowed terror. The mule, righteous at last, tore its rope and bolted like truth released. Rowan leapt in front of the spill as Tempe grabbed a wet wool blanket from the wash line and flung it down, trying to herd flame like a stray. Heat bit eyebrows. Smoke curled, greedy. The plank with Tempe's name glowed along the carved letters as if someone were writing them again in a hand made of ember. We stop here, at the edge of that flare, breath held, hearts knocking the inside of our chests like fists on wood. The next part will ask every character to show exactly who they are. Preacher and foreman, lawman and trapper, student and teacher, the man with 2 names and the woman with one she carved herself. Will the school survive? Will the warrant stand? Will the cabin that turned a girl from useless to necessary burn to the ground? Or will the mountain decide to keep what belongs to it now? If you need to know, if you can feel the heat from where you sit and the choice crackling toward an answer, subscribe and keep that bell rung. Part 2 is coming, and it won't wait for anyone.